The fog rolled thick through the narrow streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, transforming the East End of London into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Gas lamps flickered weakly against the eternal dampness, casting pools of sickly yellow light that barely penetrated the gloom. In the warren of alleys and courts, where the poorest of London's poor huddled in overcrowded tenements, terror walked freely. This was a place where a shilling meant the difference between a bed and the street, where women sold the only commodity they possessed just to survive another night, where children grew old before their time and hope was a luxury no one could afford. Into this desperate world came something darker still, something that would transform these forgotten streets into the most notorious crime scene in history. The name would echo through the ages, becoming synonymous with mystery, horror, and unsolved evil: Jack the Ripper. Even now, more than a century later, those three words carry a chill, conjuring images of fog-shrouded Victorian London and a killer who vanished into legend without ever revealing his face. To understand the terror that gripped Whitechapel during those dark months, you must first understand the world in which these crimes occurred. Victorian London was a city of stark contrasts, where unimaginable wealth existed mere streets away from crushing poverty. The East End, and Whitechapel in particular, represented the absolute nadir of London life. This was where the city's industrial revolution had created a nightmare landscape of overcrowding, disease, and desperation. Families of 10 or more crammed into single rooms. The air itself was poisonous, thick with the smoke from thousands of coal fires and the noxious fumes of factories, tanneries, and slaughterhouses. The Thames, which ran alongside these districts, was an open sewer, its waters black with filth and industrial waste. In these conditions, thousands struggled simply to exist. Work was scarce and paid poorly when it could be found at all. Men labored in the docks when ships came in, competing desperately for a day's wages. Women took in washing or sewing, working their fingers raw for pennies. But for many women, particularly those without family or those who had fallen into alcoholism, there was only one reliable way to earn the 4 pence needed for a bed in a common lodging house. They walked the streets. The number of prostitutes in Whitechapel at this time is estimated to have been around 1,200, though the actual figure was likely higher. These were not the glamorous courtesans of the West End. These were desperate women, often middle-aged or older, worn down by life, many of them alcoholics, selling themselves for pennies in dark alleys and courtyards. They were invisible to respectable society, barely human in the eyes of those who passed through the East End in carriages, which made them perfect victims. The murders began in late summer, though there remains debate about exactly which killings should be attributed to the same hand. Most scholars agree on 5 canonical victims, though the Ripper may have killed as few as 4 or as many as 9 women. The pattern of the crimes, their brutality, and certain specific mutilations link them together in a way that suggests a single perpetrator, one who became more confident and more savage with each killing. The terror built gradually, beginning with violence that seemed merely brutal, before escalating into something that appeared almost ritualistic in its horror. Marianne Nichols was 43 years old when she died in the early morning hours of August 31st, 1888. Known as Polly to her friends, she had been married with 5 children, but alcohol had destroyed her family life. By the summer of 1888, she was living in common lodging houses in Spitalfields, occasionally employed in domestic work, but more often walking the streets to earn her bed money. On the night of her death, she had been turned away from her lodging house at number 18 Thrall Street because she lacked the 4 pence required for a bed. She was not discouraged. She had earned the money several times that day only to spend it on drink. As she left, she boasted about the new bonnet she was wearing, confident she would earn her DOS money again. It was the last time her friends saw her alive. The double event, as it would come to be known, occurred in the early morning hours of September 30th, 1888. The Ripper struck twice within the space of an hour, and one of these attacks may have been interrupted, leading him to kill again almost immediately to satisfy whatever dark compulsion drove him. Elizabeth Stride, known as Long Liz, was a 44-year-old Swedish immigrant who, like the previous victims, had fallen into poverty and street prostitution. Her body was discovered at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street by Louis Diemschutz, the steward of a working men's club. His horse actually shied away from the body in the darkness. When Diemschutz lit a match, he saw a woman lying on her side in a pool of blood. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the previous victims, there was no mutilation of the body. Many experts believe the killer was interrupted, possibly by Diemschutz's arrival, and fled before he could complete his ritual. If this is true, it explains what happened next. Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old woman who used several names, was released from police custody at Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 o'clock in the morning. She had been held there for being drunk and disorderly earlier in the evening. She gave a false name and left, heading southwest into the City of London, a different jurisdiction from Whitechapel, which fell under Metropolitan Police Authority. At 1:35 in the morning, Police Constable Edward Watkins entered Mitre Square as part of his regular beat. The square was empty. He continued on his route, which took approximately 14 minutes to complete. When he returned to Mitre Square at 1:44, just 9 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes lay dead in the southwest corner of the square. The speed with which the killer murdered and mutilated her is almost beyond comprehension. Her throat was cut. Her face was slashed and mutilated. Her abdomen was opened, and her intestines pulled out and arranged over her right shoulder. Her uterus and left kidney were removed and taken away. The killer had also cut away her eyelids and made cuts that disfigured her face beyond recognition. All of this was accomplished in fewer than 9 minutes, possibly as few as 5 minutes, in a space that was visited by a police constable every 14 to 15 minutes. The audacity was breathtaking. The skill and speed suggested either incredible luck or intimate knowledge of police patrol patterns. But the killer was not finished with Catherine Eddowes even after her death. Approximately 45 minutes after the murder, a blood-stained piece of her apron was found in the doorway of a building on Goulston Street, about 1/3 of a mile from Mitre Square. Above it, written in white chalk on the black dado of the wall, was a message. The exact wording has been disputed, as the message was erased by order of Commissioner Warren before it could be properly photographed, but it read something like, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Warren's decision to erase this message remains controversial. He claimed he feared it would incite anti-Semitic riots, as there was a significant Jewish population in the area, and tensions were already high. Others believed he destroyed crucial evidence. The message's meaning remains obscure. Was it written by the killer? Was it already there and coincidence? Did it refer to Jewish people or to something else entirely? We will never know. The double event caused mass panic. The idea that the killer could strike twice in one night, that he could work so quickly and efficiently, that he seemed to have supernatural abilities to avoid capture, created an atmosphere of terror in the East End. Women were afraid to walk the streets at night. Local residents formed vigilance committees to patrol the areas. The press demanded resignations from police leadership. Reward money was offered. Spiritualists claimed they could channel the dead victims or divine the killer's identity. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, faced intense pressure in Parliament. Every man in Whitechapel fell under suspicion. Doctors, butchers, slaughtermen, sailors, actors, any man who might possess the anatomical knowledge or steadiness of hand to perform such mutilations became potential suspects. The police received hundreds of letters, many claiming to be from the killer. Most were obvious hoaxes, but some struck a more unsettling tone.
Her heart was missing, presumably taken by the killer. The flesh from her thighs and abdomen was removed and placed on a table. The room's walls were splattered with blood. Pieces of flesh were piled near the fire. The killer had burned some of Kelly's clothing in the fireplace, possibly for Light to see by as he worked. The entire scene suggested hours of work, a killer so confident that he felt comfortable spending most of the night with his victim, mutilating her body with what seemed like deliberate, methodical precision. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly was so savage, so far beyond even the previous killings, that it seemed to represent either a crescendo or a finale. The killer had removed all restraint, had given himself entirely to whatever compulsion drove him. The photographs taken at the scene, which still exist in police archives, show a horror almost incomprehensible. Those who saw the body, hardened police officers and physicians who had seen death in many forms, were shaken to their core. The funeral, paid for by local residents, drew huge crowds. The entire East End turned out to watch the procession. The press coverage reached fever pitch. Theories multiplied. Rewards were offered. The police investigated hundreds of suspects. And then, nothing. The murders stopped. After Mary Jane Kelly, there were no more killings that could be definitively attributed to Jack the Ripper. A few later murders bore some similarities, and debate continues about whether the Ripper might have been responsible for these as well. But the canonical 5 victims all died between August and November of 1888, and after Kelly's murder in November, the distinctive pattern of throat cutting and abdominal mutilation ceased. The killer, whoever he was, stopped. Why? Theories abound. Perhaps he died from illness or suicide or accident. Perhaps he was institutionalized in an asylum. Perhaps he left the country, sailing to America or Australia or somewhere else entirely. Perhaps he was arrested for some other crime and imprisoned or executed. Perhaps he simply stopped, his compulsion satisfied or his nerve broken by the scale of what he had done. Or perhaps he continued to kill elsewhere, in a different manner that did not attract the same attention. We cannot know. He vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind only questions and a legacy of terror. The investigation into the Ripper murders was extensive but ultimately fruitless. The police interviewed thousands of people. They investigated hundreds of suspects. They followed up on countless tips and theories, but they operated under enormous disadvantages. Forensic science, as we know it, did not exist. There was no way to analyze blood types or trace fibers or lift fingerprints. Witness testimony was unreliable, particularly in an area where many people distrusted the police, and where the dim lighting and fog made accurate descriptions nearly impossible. The investigation was also hampered by jurisdictional issues, with the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police operating separately and not always sharing information effectively. The press interference, while it kept the case in the public eye, also generated thousands of false leads that police had to investigate, draining resources and time. Despite these obstacles, the police did identify several strong suspects, men whose circumstances or behavior made them plausible candidates for the Ripper's identity. These suspects have been debated and analyzed for over a century, with new theories emerging as researchers gain access to previously sealed documents and apply modern analytical techniques to old evidence. Some suspects were identified by the police at the time. Others have been proposed by later researchers and authors. None can be proven definitively, but examining the most prominent suspects gives us insight into both the investigation and the nature of the crimes themselves.
On September 27th, just days before the double event, the Central News Agency received a letter dated September 25th and postmarked September 27th. Written in red ink in a flowing hand, it began, "Dear Boss," and was signed Jack the Ripper. This was the first use of that name, and it was this letter that gave the killer his infamous moniker. The letter writer taunted the police, claimed responsibility for the murders, and promised to continue killing. He wrote that he loved his work and wanted to get to work right away. He mentioned cutting off a victim's ears and sending them to the police. The letter was initially dismissed as a hoax, one of many. But then, on October 1st, the day after the double event, another letter arrived, this one a postcard also addressed to the Central News Agency. Written in the same hand as the Dear Boss letter, it referenced the double murder that had just occurred, something that would not yet have been widely reported when the postcard was written. "Double event this time," it read, and it was signed with the same red ink signature. The writer mentioned that he had not had time to get the ears from one victim, a reference to the fact that Catherine Eddowes' ear had been partially cut through. This detail had not been released to the public. The authenticity of these letters has been debated ever since. Many experts believe they were hoaxes, possibly created by a journalist seeking to sensationalize the story and sell newspapers. Others believe at least some of them may have been genuine communications from the killer. The truth is, we cannot know. But the name stuck. Jack the Ripper. It was perfect for the press, easy to remember, frightening, and somehow capturing the essence of the crimes. The crude brutality of the murders combined with something almost playful in the killer's ability to evade capture. The name transformed the murderer from a simple criminal into something larger, something almost mythical. He became London's boogeyman, the invisible phantom who stalked the fog-shrouded streets. For 6 weeks after the double event, there were no more murders that bore the Ripper's signature. Perhaps he had fled. Perhaps he had satisfied whatever urge drove him. Perhaps he had died or been institutionalized or left the country. As October wore on, the police slowly began to relax. Vigilance committees wound down. The press found other stories. Life in Whitechapel began to return to its normal state of grim subsistence. And then came the final murder, the one so horrific that it seemed to exist in a category beyond even the previous atrocities. This was not a murder carried out in haste in a dark alley or yard. This was something different. This was the killer taking his time, doing exactly what he wanted without fear of interruption. This was Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly was younger than the other victims, only 25 years old at the time of her death. She was also different in other ways. She was attractive, or had been before poverty and drink began to take their toll. She claimed to have been born in Limerick, Ireland, though this may not have been true. She had lived a harder life than her years suggested, possibly working in a high-class brothel in the West End before circumstances brought her down to the streets of Spitalfields. She rented a small ground-floor room at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street, one of the most dangerous streets in London. The room was tiny, barely 12 feet square, containing a bed, a table, and a fireplace. Kelly had fallen behind on her rent, owing 29 shillings to her landlord, but he had not evicted her. She was last seen alive around 2 a.m. on November 9, 1888, apparently with a client. A witness reported hearing a faint cry of "murder" around 4 a.m, but such cries were not uncommon in that neighborhood and were generally ignored. Thomas Bowyer, sent by the landlord to try to collect some of the back rent, knocked on Kelly's door at 10:45 in the morning on November 9th. Receiving no answer, he reached through the broken window and pulled back the curtain. What he saw sent him reeling backward in horror. He ran to fetch the landlord and the police. When Detective Inspector Walter Beck and others arrived and forced open the door, they entered a scene of carnage that beggared description. Mary Jane Kelly's body lay on the bed, or what remained of her body. The killer had spent hours with her, perhaps most of the night. He had mutilated her so completely that she was barely recognizable as human. Her throat was cut down to the spine. Her face was slashed and hacked beyond recognition. Her abdomen was opened entirely and her internal organs removed. Drowned in the Thames in December 1888, approximately 1 month after the final canonical murder. Papers found on his body suggested he feared he was going insane. His family had a history of mental illness, and his mother was confined to an asylum. Druitt was named as a suspect by Melville Macnagden, who became an assistant chief constable at Scotland Yard in 1889 in a private memorandum written in 1894. Macnagden, who did not work on the original Ripper investigation, stated that the case was unsolved but suggested that Druitt was the most likely suspect. However, Macnagden's information about Druitt contained several factual errors, and there is no evidence placing Druitt in Whitechapel at the times of the murders. The case against him is largely circumstantial, based on the timing of his suicide shortly after the murders ceased, and the suggestion of mental instability. Many modern researchers dismiss Druitt as a viable suspect, believing he became a scapegoat primarily because his death provided a convenient way for the police to close the case unofficially. Aaron Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel and worked as a hairdresser. He was also mentioned in McNogden's memorandum and was apparently a preferred suspect of several police officials, including Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who led the investigation. Kosminski suffered from mental illness and was eventually committed to asylums, where he spent the rest of his life. According to police accounts, a witness had identified Kosminski as the man seen with one of the victims, but refused to testify against him because the witness was also Jewish and did not want to be responsible for sending a fellow Jew to the gallows. Some asylum records describe Kosminski as having violent tendencies and delusions, though other records suggest he was largely harmless. In recent years, DNA analysis on a shawl supposedly from one of the crime scenes has been claimed to link Kosminski to the murders. But this evidence has been heavily criticized by experts as unreliable, with questions about the shawl's provenance and the validity of the DNA testing procedures. Kosminski remains a popular suspect, particularly in the theory that the Ripper was a local man who knew the streets intimately, but definitive proof remains elusive. Michael Ostrog was a Russian-born con artist and thief with a long criminal record. He was also mentioned in the McNogden memorandum as a possible suspect. Ostrog was known to police as a habitual criminal who used multiple aliases and who had been confined to asylums on several occasions. However, research into Ostrog's whereabouts during the autumn of 1888 has largely eliminated him as a serious suspect. He appears to have been in prison or abroad during some of the murders. His inclusion as a suspect seems to have been based more on his general criminality and the fact that he was foreign than on any specific evidence linking him to the Ripper crimes. Most modern researchers do not consider Ostrog a viable suspect. James Maybrick was a cotton merchant from Liverpool who died in 1889, apparently poisoned by his wife Florence in a case that became a Victorian scandal. In the 1990s, a diary supposedly written by Maybrick surfaced, in which the author claimed to be Jack the Ripper and described the murders in detail. If genuine, the diary would be one of the most significant historical documents in criminal history. However, most experts who have examined the diary believe it to be a modern forgery. The handwriting does not match known samples of Maybrick's writing. The diary contains anachronisms and information that would not have been available to someone writing in 1888. The circumstances of the diary's discovery are suspicious. While the Maybrick theory has passionate defenders, the consensus among serious researchers is that the diary is a hoax, albeit a sophisticated one. Francis Tumblety was an Irish-American quack doctor who was in London during the autumn of 1888. He was arrested in November on charges of gross indecency and fled to the United States while on bail. American newspapers reported that Scotland Yard suspected him of being the Ripper and had sent detectives to America to watch him. Tumblety had a known hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, and allegedly kept a collection of preserved uteri in jars, which he would show to visitors. He had sufficient anatomical knowledge to perform the mutilations seen in the Ripper murders. However, Tumblety was a very large, distinctive-looking man with a dramatic appearance, quite unlike the descriptions given by witnesses who claimed to have seen the Ripper or men with the victims. Additionally, his whereabouts during all of the murders cannot be confirmed. He remains a plausible, if unlikely, suspect.
James Maybrick was a cotton merchant from Liverpool who died in 1889, apparently poisoned by his wife Florence in a case that became a Victorian scandal. In the 1990s, a diary supposedly written by Maybrick surfaced, in which the author claimed to be Jack the Ripper and described the murders in detail. If genuine, the diary would be one of the most significant historical documents in criminal history. However, most experts who have examined the diary believe it to be a modern forgery. The handwriting does not match known samples of Maybrick's writing. The diary contains anachronisms and information that would not have been available to someone writing in 1888. The circumstances of the diary's discovery are suspicious. While the Maybrick theory has passionate defenders, the consensus among serious researchers is that the diary is a hoax, albeit a sophisticated one. Francis Tumblety was an Irish-American quack doctor who was in London during the autumn of 1888. He was arrested in November on charges of gross indecency and fled to the United States while on bail. American newspapers reported that Scotland Yard suspected him of being the Ripper and had sent detectives to America to watch him. Tumblety had a known hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, and allegedly kept a collection of preserved uteri in jars, which he would show to visitors. He had sufficient anatomical knowledge to perform the mutilations seen in the Ripper murders. However, Tumblety was a very large, distinctive-looking man with a dramatic appearance, quite unlike the descriptions given by witnesses who claimed to have seen the Ripper or men with the victims. Additionally, his whereabouts during all of the murders cannot be confirmed. He remains a plausible, if unlikely, suspect. George Chapman, born Severin Klaskowski, was a Polish immigrant who worked as a barber in Whitechapel in 1888. Years later, he was convicted and executed for poisoning 3 women who had been his wives or partners. The murders occurred between 1897 and 1902. Chapman used poison rather than a knife, which seems inconsistent with the Ripper's modus operandi, but the case was made for him by Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline himself, who supposedly told the detective who arrested Chapman, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Aberline may have suspected Chapman because he had anatomical training, worked in the right area at the right time, and demonstrated a clear capacity for murdering women. However, the change in method from frenzied knife attacks to slow poisoning is difficult to reconcile, and most modern profilers believe it unlikely that the same person would employ such different techniques. Chapman remains a controversial suspect. Joseph Barnett was a fish porter who had been Mary Jane Kelly's common-law husband until just days before her murder. They had lived together in the room at Miller's Court where Kelly was killed. Barnett lost his job and could no longer support Kelly, leading to arguments and eventually a separation, though he apparently still visited her and gave her money when he could. Some theorists have suggested that Barnett might have committed the previous murders in an attempt to frighten Kelly off the streets and then killed her in a rage when she continued prostituting herself. This theory requires that the timing of their separation, just before Kelly's murder, was coincidental, and that Barnett had the anatomical skill and psychological makeup to commit the earlier murders, for which there is no evidence. Most researchers do not consider Barnett a serious suspect, though his proximity to at least the final victim makes him worth mentioning. Beyond these named suspects, numerous theories have proposed that the Ripper was a doctor, a butcher, a midwife, a member of the royal family, a Freemason, or even a woman who could approach the victims without arousing suspicion. Some of the more elaborate conspiracy theories involve cover-ups by highly placed individuals or secret societies. Most of these theories are not supported by credible evidence and tell us more about the theorists' preoccupations than about the actual crimes. The royal conspiracy theory, popularized in the 1970s, suggesting that the murders were covered up by a scandalous royal marriage, has been thoroughly debunked, but continues to appear in popular culture because of its dramatic appeal.
What can we say about the Ripper based on the evidence we have? Most criminal profilers who've examined the case agree on certain broad characteristics. The killer was almost certainly male, based on witness descriptions and the physical strength required for some of the mutilations. He was probably in his 20s or 30s, old enough to have developed the confidence and skill displayed in the murders, but young enough to have the physical strength and stamina they required. He likely had some anatomical knowledge, though this need not have been formal medical training. A butcher, a slaughterman, a market worker, anyone who regularly worked with animal carcasses would have the necessary familiarity with anatomy and the ability to work with a knife. The surgical precision of some of the mutilations may have been exaggerated by contemporary accounts, and modern pathologists who have reviewed the case notes suggest the killer's skill may have been less than was claimed at the time. The killer almost certainly lived in or near Whitechapel. The crimes all occurred in a relatively small area, less than a square mile. The killer demonstrated detailed knowledge of the streets, alleys, and yards, including which areas were patrolled by police and when. He knew where he could commit his crimes with minimal risk of discovery. This suggests he was a local man, not a visitor to the area. He was probably someone who blended in, who did not attract attention. The witnesses who claimed to have seen the victims with men shortly before their deaths described ordinary-looking men, respectably dressed but not wealthy, the kind of men who would be expected in that area. The killer was not a wild-eyed monster. He was someone who could approach prostitutes, convince them to go with him into dark, secluded areas, and then transform into something monstrous once they were alone and vulnerable. The psychological profile suggested by the murders is chilling. The escalation from victim to victim, the increasing savagery and time taken with each murder suggests someone satisfying a compulsion that grew stronger with each killing. The removal of organs, particularly the reproductive organs, suggests a sexual element to the crimes, though whether the murders themselves were sexually motivated or whether the mutilations served some other psychological need is debated. The fact that the murders stopped after Kelly's death could indicate that particular murder satisfied the killer in a way the others had not, or that it shocked even him into cessation, or that some external factor intervened. Serial killers who stop of their own volition are rare, which supports theories that the killer died, was institutionalized, or was imprisoned for other crimes. The Ripper murders had profound effects on British society beyond the immediate terror they created. They highlighted the desperate conditions in the East End and led to some limited reforms and increased charitable work in the area. They exposed the inadequacies of police methods and led to pressure for improved detective work and investigative techniques. They spawned an entirely new genre of crime reporting and public fascination with serial murder. The murders helped establish the template for how society responds to serial killers, a template we still follow today, with extensive media coverage, public panic, police under pressure to solve the case, theories and speculation running wild. The Ripper also became the first truly famous serial killer known around the world, his name becoming a cultural touchstone. Part of this fame stems from the gruesome nature of the crimes themselves. Part comes from the mystery of his identity. Part comes from the setting, Victorian London with its fog and gas lamps providing a perfect Gothic backdrop. And part comes from the name itself, Jack the Ripper, which transforms a sordid series of murders into something almost mythological. The Ripper has appeared in countless books, films, television shows, and plays. He has been portrayed as everything from a supernatural beeman to a tragic figure driven by madness. Theories about his identity continue to proliferate, with new books appearing regularly claiming to have finally solved the mystery. Tours of Ripper sites are a staple of London tourism. The fascination shows no sign of diminishing. But we should remember, beneath all the mythology and mystery, the real tragedy of the Ripper case. 5 women, possibly more, died terrifying deaths. They were not just victims in a historical mystery. They were real people. Women who had fallen on hard times, who struggled to survive in brutal conditions, who had families and friends and lives before circumstances reduced them to walking dark streets at night. Mary Ann Nichols left 5 children behind. Annie Chapman's funeral was attended by mourners who remembered her as a kind woman fallen on hard times. Elizabeth Stride had friends who wept for her. Catherine Eddowes had a common-law husband who identified her mutilated body. Mary Jane Kelly was young, and despite her circumstances, people who knew her said she had retained some spark of hope, some sense that life might improve. These women deserve to be remembered as more than just the Ripper's victims. The investigation files remained open for decades after the murders. Police continued to investigate tips and follow up on theories long after the public had moved on to other concerns. The last official suspect investigated by police died in the 1920s. Eventually, the files were closed and locked away. In the late 20th century, many of these files were released to the public, allowing researchers unprecedented access to the actual investigative records. This has led to new theories and renewed interest in the case, with amateur and professional researchers poring over the documents, looking for clues that the original investigators might have missed. Modern technology has been applied to the case with mixed results. Attempts to extract DNA from letters supposedly written by the killer have been inconclusive. The DNA analysis of the shawl mentioned earlier, while generating headlines, has largely been dismissed by serious researchers due to methodological problems and questions about the chain of custody. Psychological profiling techniques have been applied retrospectively to the case, but without the killer to compare the profile against, this remains largely theoretical. Geographical profiling, which analyzes the locations of crimes to suggest where a serial offender might live, has been applied and suggests the killer lived in the immediate vicinity of the crimes, which most researchers already assumed.